reversion to of sorts, older policy of the building department.
20 seconds. Okay. In that case, then, I'm going to convene the the January 16, 2018 Ojai Building Appeals Board meeting convened. Shall we do a roll call?
Member Daddy?
Here.
Member Murphy?
Here.
Member Farmer?
Here.
Chair Ulrich?
Here.
And myself, Dale Hansen, I'm here.
Very good. In that case, Pledge of Allegiance. Judy, would you like to lead?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, public communications. Is the time set aside during the Building Appeals Board meeting for the members of the public to address the Building Appeals Board on items of city business other than scheduled agenda items. Matters raised at this time may be briefly discussed by the board and will generally be referred to staff and or placed on a subsequent agenda. Under state law, other than for emergency items, no action on non-agendized items can be taken at this meeting. We have one speaker card for public communication, and that's Councilman Wyrick.
As your liaison for the first quarter, I wanted to make a few comments for the new year, because I'm hoping we have, frankly, a more productive year in terms of BAB getting, working with the building official and getting recommendations to council. And I want to make one statement for the record in terms of all concern to ponder about lessons learned and how and what we need to do better. And I'll give 4 examples of what I would call de facto, not necessarily intentional, but de facto staff nullification of council intent. And the kind of thing that I think we all should take to heart and try and seek to avoid doing in the future. And the 4 examples I want to give are, first and foremost, the most clear example was when we found the building department starting to apply Title 24 current code standards to the non-conforming program for our non-conforming units. Basically cutting the heart out of the clear intent of council with respect to the non-conforming program. And it's the kind of thing that I just think is important to point out should not happen. That after hours of deliberation by council and clear policy decisions for the mechanics of staff operation, bring in something that goes so clearly and oppositely against the clear intent of council with the nonconforming program. Number 2, when we have, and this is an experience that I have personally had over quite some time, with respect to the code on fences and walls and code enforcement. The code is very clearly written, and we've had a succession of staff interpretations that are incomplete in terms of implementing the code enforcement with that part of our municipal code that says that's not what we think it says. In fact, it's what it clearly says in terms of sitting down and reading the black and white. And my point is that if staff has a problem with the actual wording of the code and code enforcement with respect to the wording of the code, the issue is not to ignore the code, which in effect is ignoring the intent of past councils and ignoring the will of the people through your elected representatives, but to come back to council and say, we need to fix this, as opposed to simply ignoring, which is what happened with code enforcement for a period of a couple years on the fences and walls issue. Another example has been that, and these come into the category of things that we're Ojai and we're different. And so what happens in other cities doesn't apply to us unless the case is made that it should. That's just the way our culture is here. And I think we all need to take that to heart, staff and commissioners and everybody. And for example, they have a long issue where the city attorney multiple times has stated very clearly that nothing is adopted for us by the Ventura County Fire Department. That those ordinances have to be ratified by council before they're effective in the city of Ojai. And when staff argues oppositely that, after multiple city attorney opinions and council ratification of that opinion, again, it becomes a form of staff nullification of council intent. And it should not happen. And last, I think it's important as we enter a new phase with, successor building official liaison to the BAB, that we make sure that there is a institutional memory. I hope I'm going to kind of put it on the chair of the BAB and the new building official and Mr. Vega to make sure that we have the institutional memory conveyance of communications to date. We do a bad job of conveying institutional memory here. And for example, the council has very clearly passed a resolution in two parts in terms of assignments to the Building Appeals Board. The council specified by resolution the frequency by which BAB meetings would occur until that list was done. And frankly, there was an issue of, to some extent, ignoring that direction from council, that specific stipulations from council. So, whether or not, when, for example, we had a clear direction of looking at looking at the CAL FIRE situation, looking at our maps, and coming back with recommendations to council. And there's nothing to be gained by arguing about whether or not that was a specific assignment to the BAB. I think the clear language was, in other words, we should not be looking for, well, did council really mean that? Well, don't ask anyone except council that question. And it certainly should never be used as an excuse for a lack of moving forward in terms of action. Get clarification from the source, not any Herman, remember the glass bead game by Herman Hesse? Endlessly playing with your glass beads and never getting anything done. So please, let's look at the new year of focusing on what needs to be done, having deliberations and a productive relationship with the staff liaison or liaisons to focus on what council's asked you to come up with and get it going. Get it back, get recommendations back to us, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any comments? Any observations? Okay. In that case, then, let's proceed to our building officials report. Actually, it says building officials report first, doesn't it?
All right, Chair, just wanted
Yes.
to bring up one thing for sure was the second dwelling unit program promotion is at this time scheduled for the next council meeting for the 23rd. I know we said it was supposed to be another meeting, but we didn't get it on there, but it's supposed to be on the 23rd. And also we did, staff did pass out the maps for you folks to look at. And that's all I got.
Okay. Right. In that case, then the consent item, our next,
Chair, could we go back over that again? That was one of these things that flew by. Would you tell me what we're going to have on the 23rd at the council specifically? I mean, having things on and having things on after a couple of decades with this group, it's kind of different what having things mean.
Well, the second dwelling unit program promotion that the BAB created and was going to go to council. You guys did it back maybe October or September.
Okay, that's why I can't remember what's going on. Okay. That's why I can't remember. Well, then, rats. I wished we had had a synopsis of what is going to be given to council. Because all too many times I hear people repeat what I didn't say until I get on the disc and I watch myself on TV and I make sure that, yeah, I really didn't say that and I really meant this and I didn't include that. And so I'm very concerned what is going to be conveyed to council in my name and want to make sure I understand it, especially with part of the misunderstanding. And what I would like somebody to do before they put this thing together for council is I would like them to go back and look at the last discussion with Miss Mario. And I would like us to bold and italicize and put in quotations what the qualifications are for the second unit compliance, which I believe, in my memory, was you must have a carbon monoxide alarm and the water heater must be strapped down. And I understand we had a lengthy discussion where those were the only two items. And when we say the second unit, it's there's a kind of a lot of second units. And I really want to make it's the second unit compliance or non-conforming, because you can put a lot of different second units. You can put in granny flats and guest house and ADUs. You can put on all kinds of them. And I want to make sure the council understands these are the existing structures that are here without permits that are actually constructed not to be and not converted yet. So if we could make sure, Mr. Vega, that we have something in there where they understand and the community understands, carbon monoxide alarms aren't that tough. Strapping a water heater's not that tough. And it can't have bare dangly wires and, some of these other things that, are incredibly easy to see that are health and safety. But my understanding is that is the limit. And I'd like to get a confirmation from the building official that we have here today that that is, in fact, a correct recollection of the discussion.
I don't know. I will get you the information. I'll get it to you tomorrow.
Okay, well, we have the information on tape. And so, Mr. Vega, then maybe you could go back and you could reconstruct that and make sure that gets accurately on the agenda. Because this thing has been going around, we've been chasing our tail for 3 years. Now, if City Council has decided that they're no longer interested in meeting SB 35, and City Council has decided they're no longer interested in the RENA numbers, we can chase our tail for 3 more years, because we've been run around the racetrack, and it's kind of time for the BAB to stop and get our information to council. So, thank you very much.
So, okay, so to clarify, this is item number 2 on the council assigned tasks for the Building Appeals Board task list dated 7/16/17. And the recommendations that were discussed and incorporated into a resolution are what the Building Appeals Board needs to see, just to confirm it is, in fact, what the resolution that we intended before it gets handed up to the City Council. And that's really all it is. It's confirmatory. Okay. So having said that, shall we address the minutes for on the consent calendar? And I have a yes. And they're included in as item number 1. Has everyone had a chance to review that? I have a question regarding one of the items. Actually, one of the items toward the end of that consent, I seem to have misplaced mine now that I'm looking at it, of course. So, can I borrow yours for this moment? And that is item number 1, and it would be page 5 of 5. It's the second paragraph from the top. It said, the paragraph begins, Board Member Hanson believed that there should be a wildfire campaign in the city and county to notify residents of wildfire dangers. Chair Ulrich disagreed. I don't believe that's an accurate representation at all of my comment that succeeded Board Member Hanson's. So I would, if that can't get clarified, at least strike the Chair Ulrich disagreed, simply because I didn't.
Well, it's not like you to disagree anyway.
Well, without further explanation. I mean, you know, or enlargement or comment or clarification, so.
They just put a blanket disagree on all of the
Yeah,
items for you.
and especially that suggestion, which is a good one. I think considering this was the minutes for the September 19, it was very prescient and thoughtful comment on the part of Board Member Hanson. So, does anyone have any comments regarding any of the other contents of that particular okay. It seems rather dense from that perspective. Okay. So, in that case, then, are we ready to approve that? Yeah. You want to do a roll call?
All in favor of approving the minutes of September 19th, 2017?
Aye.
Aye.
Any disapprove?
Okay. All right, so the next item is selection of new Building Appeals Board chairpersons and vice chairperson. I kind of looked into when I was seated, and I was seated in February.
So you haven't been here a year.
Yes, so, well, let us postpone that item until the next meeting next month. Okay? We need to take a vote on that?
What's the postponement?
Yes.
All those in favor?
Question first.
Yes.
Why is this being brought up now, and how did it get put on the agenda?
Well, there's a rather lengthy explanation in the staff report component. It's recommendations, staff recommendations in the administrative report of discussion item number 2. And then there's a rather lengthy discussion of it. So, you know, there's a couple of options there that are inherent in that process. I'm just saying from a practical perspective, this is premature by at least a month.
Yeah, I agree.
This may not be the time to bring this up, but my, on that same report that you are referencing, I am listed as my term expiring in 2020. In fact, I came on to fill out the last 2 years of Steve Quillis's for term. So I'm not sure who to take that to, but I noticed it was incorrect on this.
Well, that,
Well, we can check that and
yeah,
make
that
the
seems to
correction.
me to need to be rebalanced then.
And when we go to look at it rebalancing, I would like the actual enabling language that put us here to be looked at first, because it's very, very precise, and it says the chair shall serve for 1 year, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we take a look, and this is a state mandated program, not a city program, so if we take a look at that enabling legislation that put us here in the first place, it's fairly clear. So, you know, whether we're going to do it now or not is something I think that probably doesn't need to come back next meeting. It might come back the meeting after that depending on when the next meeting is.
Can I say something?
Okay? So I don't know when we're gonna meet again. I don't know if we're on a 2-week cycle or a 3-week cycle
Well, we
again.
meet again in February, right? But my understanding was that the chair could serve more than 1 year. It's not necessary that it be passed on from 1 year at a time. Is that not correct?
The
Anyone
chair can be reappointed and revoted on by the board
Okay.
from year to year without changing,
know? Okay.
but it needs to be addressed every year, is what it
Makes
says.
sense.
Okay, so then we'll move to discussion item 3, which is the Building Appeals Board will develop an updated Ojai-specific fire hazard map. Still can't find it. Which will include all areas within the city limits, as well as the Ojai Sphere of Influence, SOI, and will recommend this map to the City Council for adoption and furtherance of the city's interest in combustible fuel management and overall wildfire safety for the community. So to that end, we have from the city's information produced several maps or which pertain to the zoning of the city and also produce an outline of the city's sphere of influence, which extends to the east, inclusive of Siete Robles, Gorham Road, and
That is Gridley all the way up.
that is Gridley, an extension all the way up to the top of Gridley, a line going across from east to west, and for all intents and purposes encompassing Foothill Road area, Fairview Road to Route 33, all of the Arbolata, and all of the area between 33 and the city limits in the vicinity of Del Norte. Yes.
There's this one section here that the red line does not include, but the white does, and it's at El Camino Drive on the left side. Is that in or out of the sphere of influence?
To the left of the red line?
Yeah, it's to the
Doesn't
left.
include that.
So that's not part of it, even though it's
No.
outlined in white. Okay, thank you.
And when you go all the way to the north, you take a look at the very top left corner. That is down at Myers Road in the riverbed,
Oh, it is?
all the way up past Bodie's Restaurant. So that is down where the horse corrals are. That is where Fairview Road comes down, goes all the way across to Rice. Rice then goes down into the riverbed and north, all the way up, including that subdivision. So our sphere of influence encompasses an area almost equal to the size of the entire city outside of the city limits, which is heavily involved with fuel and brush.
Okay, and it's our direction from council and our stated goal to generate a map with input from various other agencies and our own input that can be recommended for adoption to the council that accurately represents combustible fuel management areas and overall wildfire threat and identification. And this is in direct response to the what's referred to as the CAL FIRE map, which was originally generated in 2007 and adopted by default by the city in 2010, which we've reviewed in past meetings and found to be insufficient as far as comprehensive coverage information imparted to it, and lack of any gradation of fire threat. So at that point then, we also have several other maps that we're looking at in conjunction with this map that have to do with terrain, with an overlay of the streets, a map, and then the FEMA preliminary 100-year floodplain and parcels that are within that as of 4/29/2016. Parcels affected by the 100-year floodplain, and since those areas in the city and in the sphere of influence may be subject and exposed to flooding and debris flow as a consequence of the Thomas Fire. Would anyone like to start the conversation, the discussion?
I would,
Well, there isn't a staff report on this. It's item number 3, and there isn't any staff report. So perhaps actually at this point, you have anything further that could be added to it? Any?
No.
Okay.
I think we just.
All right.
Intent, I think, was just for you folks to.
Yes. All right.
Go through it.
I would like to make a recommendation that we have Vice Chair of the Planning Commission, who's in the audience, Mr. Quillisi, get up and give us a discussion from his perspective. He has material maps and other things that he's familiar with, and I would like to hear from someone we have in the audience to start us off. So we can then go ahead and kick it around and then interact.
Yeah, well, in other words, since the esteemed Planning Commission member is signed up here for agenda item 3, let's turn this a little bit around and perhaps get you speaking on what you brought to the meeting, and then we can engage in the discussion.
Thank you, Chair, board members, and staff. Esteemed, Mama would be proud. I have received a fair amount of information having to do with water in particular, as well as fuel load, that I think should affect the decisions made on the fire map. And I haven't been through all of it yet, but in particular I'm interested in water. I think that we can establish from the data that we have that's 3.5 years old that there are places in the city right now where there is insufficient water pressure or water flow to protect structures in the area of a fire hydrant. There are also areas of the city where there are no fire hydrants. I'm thinking of Lower Ventura Avenue as we head down toward the Creek Road. I don't know how this has escaped, if it has in fact escaped the notice of insurance companies. I don't know. But certainly if there are no fire hydrants in your neighborhood, that's got to affect the risk and the premiums that go with it. But from the point of view of the city, it should be an area of concern, because if a fire starts in that area, it can't be stopped, at least not very practically, and it presents a risk to all the adjacent areas, which may have fire hydrants, but shouldn't have had to worry about using their fire hydrants, because the folks next door shouldn't have been on fire and uncontrollable.
Excuse me for a moment, Steve. This was brought to your attention personally based on where your residence is.
Well, I have to say I'm very lucky in that my neighborhood, West Eucalyptus Street, has transitioned from having a single 4-inch hydrant at one end of the street to having a 6-inch hydrant and a new 6-inch water main under the street, a new 6-inch hydrant at each end of the block. So we're golden now. But there are a lot of places that aren't, and you can just drive around the city and see these little 4-inch skinny
Wharf.
fire hydrants.
Wharf
Okay,
hydrants.
yeah, okay. They look like you might find on a pier, I guess, on a wooden pier. But I'm beginning to wonder, and I mentioned something briefly to Councilmember Wyrick. It may be time, as we discussed in our the Planning Commission City Council meeting, it may be time, and I would hate to do it, but for us to say if development is proposed for a particular parcel in the city, we should be able collectively, Planning Commission, BAB, City Council, whatever, we should have the data to be able to say, is that parcel protectable in case of fire? And I would say right now there are areas in the city where there are parcels that are not protectable. Now, we don't have very good data. I have been given a copy of a public records request that Chair Ulrich had put together 3.5 years ago that talks about fire hydrants in the city and when they were tested, and valves in the city and when they were tested. And I don't personally know right now if anything has been done since the middle of 2014. If it hasn't, then shame on everybody that's involved in this, but particularly the late unlamented Golden State Water Company. But at this point, we have a new water purveyor, and that water purveyor needs to get busy figuring out the condition of the plant in this city and figuring out whether or not they can, in fact, provide water for fire protection all over this city. And I'm contending that there are numerous areas where they cannot, at this point, accurately say, yes, we can do that. And I'm wondering if maybe the time has come for the city. I know the city council just said the building department will no longer require a will serve letter from the water company before granting a building permit. But we might consider whether or not it would be reasonable. Yeah, well, I'm sorry. My understanding was the city council said that the building department will not require a will serve letter in advance of giving a building permit.
Much more narrowly defined.
Okay,
But go ahead.
okay.
Narrow circumstances,
I'm wondering if the time might have come,
not general.
yeah, when the building department should require on a building permit a letter from the water purveyor saying, yes, we can in fact provide sufficient water pressure and flow in the vicinity of that parcel where you're proposing development of whatever sort, that you can be protected from fire.
Okay, it's kind of critical to define what you mean by development. You're talking about new development? You're talking about a building permit?
I'm talking
What do you
about a
want,
building
sir?
permit. It could be for an ADU, it could be for conversion,
Okay, in other words, a change of use,
change of use.
substantial
It-
change of use.
It could be for building a new ADU, it could be for converting something into an ADU, could be changing a guest house to an ADU, I don't care. I think that we need to look very seriously at the provision of water within the city. And I think that should be a factor in putting together the fire map.
Vice Chair,
Yes,
question. Could that be distilled down to a change of water use on the parcel? So when we split lots from 1 to 4, from 2 to 4, it's a change. When we build or add on, when we add additional, those are all in changes in water use. And my question is why Planning Commission, when there's a review, couldn't require as part of the packet certain specifications to go along with the architectural drawings the concept reviews, all the things that you folks pre-screen
Yes.
prior to them. I'm wondering why that couldn't be a new planning commission requirement, because it really is Title 10 and zoning, which is our planning commission's job.
When it's a ministerial decision, I don't think that we have sufficient standards by which a ministerial decision could be made with regard to fire protection. Planning Commission clearly receives cases that require discretionary approval, I think. Is that right? And that's why Planning Commission has the discretion to approve or not approve. But we don't see everything. There are lots of building permits that are issued, I am sure, without any review by the Planning Commission because all of the current standards are met within that permit.
Maybe it's time to modify the standards.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Maybe we need some new standards that involve fire protectability, or call it what you will, with regard to a particular parcel. I think the other thing that appeals to me as highest priority as a factor in the fire map is the fuel load. We have areas of the city where we have open fields, and we have areas of the city where we have thickly forested pieces, whether it's along stream beds or whether it's around the edges of parks. And I understand there's a restriction that you cannot classify something of a size less than, 20 acres. So you have to kind of go neighborhood by neighborhood, I think, in classifying, what's it called, fire severity. But that is something that I think needs to be done, and it's much more finely grained than simply talking about big areas of the city. It's not as finely grained if you're looking at the provision of water. But I think both the availability of water for fire prevention or reduction, call it what you will, and the consideration of the fuel load, whether it's dead plants or live plants, live trees, whatever. We know that pines go up quickly, eucalyptus trees can burn very brightly and relatively quickly, and other types of trees less so. And so those things need to be looked at, I think, as part of your fire map. In addition, again, we need better data on the availability of water for fire protection around the city. And I think that's pretty much what I have to say. There's a lot of data here, but it's relatively outdated at this point, unless there really hasn't been any testing of hydrants and valves and all that stuff since Mr. Ulrich's public records request 3.5 years ago. And if there aren't any work, if there isn't any work going on in that area of making sure that we have good fire protection water system in the interim since that, then we have a much bigger problem, I suspect, than we think. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The, just as an observation relative to that, the status of our system is, I think the community, for whether it's a valid basis or not, has gotten kind of complacent about that critical element, fire water, if there's enough pressure, if there's enough volume. Any exercise that we engage in to draft a fire hazard, an updated and accurate fire hazard severity map, and to identify combustible fuel stockpiles will be merely an exercise at the best in the event that we have a fire and there isn't adequate water. And that happens enough times in recent memory, say within the last 15 years, that ostensibly, I mean, how many warnings do you need? And apparently we continue to need warnings because the one entity that had the force and authority and legal force, and authority to require that the City of Ojai fire water system be adequate and operational according to contemporary standards. Was and is the Ventura County Fire Department and Ventura County Fire Protection District. And we've spoken with them several times. There seems to be sort of a disinclination, I think is the best way I would describe it, to cause the water purveyor to provide what they are obligated to provide. And I believe it's by law and by contract. Having said that, we now have another water purveyor that has elected to, as the first instance of a significant capital expenditure, put in water meters, and is getting around to a engineering assessment of the condition of the overall Ojai system. And in the case of the folks on Mallory Way and West Eucalyptus, which was egregious insufficiency given the number of structures on the section of those two streets, has put in a new main and, as you indicated, new hydrants, and you are feeling, if not safe, much safer in that zone. However, that condition is rampant throughout the community, even where there are 6-inch hydrants. They may not have pressure or volume or both. And the reasons given, I think, for not having actually done what, in my experience, having built some fire systems, is a required test, which is to flow them, to confirm you have volume and to confirm you have pressure after it's been flowed. And the concern with water use, I think I think we can overcome by putting it into tanker trucks. That's much like what they've been doing in the city of Ventura, and then watering city trees with them. That just puts it right back into not only our heritage trees, but also which have been stressed by the drought, but also ostensibly back into the water table from whence at least part of it came. That has not been done. So at this particular point, given the overall history and my minimal experience with it, I don't believe that it's a reliable system. I think thought they had a reliable system in Ventura, and that turned out to be otherwise as well in some areas. So the issue at this point is whether the community and the agencies upon whom we depend have the will to actually produce a reliable fire water system. And while constraints on further development until adequacy of fire water system to that particular parcel is certainly laudable and achievable, I don't know that that's most of our concern is existing structures, existing properties, existing residences, existing apartment buildings. And I believe that becomes one of the adjuncts to the recommendations that the Building Appeals Board will be making to the City Council. The maps are a representation of risk and hazard, but the most powerful effort that towards actual safety of the community, fire safety for the community, is a functional and reliable fire water system, and we don't have it, and there isn't any timeline for it. And it's my understanding that when Casitas Municipal Water District is ceded to the former Golden State water system asset, there was several $1 million in that deal specifically to upgrade, repair, and render into conformance the system, the valves, the hydrants, all components of the system, such that it would not only deliver domestic water, but would, and once again, as a primary consideration, equal to, in my opinion, domestic water is fire water. And we don't have that, so. Any comments?
Judy? You don't have any comments? You're at the bottom of Signal Street with all that high fuel and brush and
Yes, wondering how long it's going to take for
in
that
that
fire.
dangerous urban forest and the Mexican fan palms and all the pine drains. You have no comment?
Okay, from a, let's kind of look, I don't know that we're gonna be able to, I mean, because there's a fairly simple approach to this, the generation of a fire map that would certainly, and not for purposes of getting everyone's attention, but would be an accurate characterization for the community, especially in light of the condition of the fire water system, would be how much of this map, I don't know if that's something that's visible, and there's a copy of it on the dais, needs to be addressed, and this is out to the City of Ojai sphere of influence. How much of this map needs to be addressed as in either very high or high fire hazard? Given that the other terrain and the photographic, aerial photographic seems to indicate that we have a heavily forested community with the wind blowing in the right direction, a fire could go anywhere. Pretty much without, in the right wind conditions, which we've seen what the wind does, without any curtailment. So, does anyone have any thoughts on how to address this overarching sphere of influence question?
Yeah, I'd like us to go back and take a look at those items we presented before. You have the sphere of influence outside. 100% of the outside sphere of influence is the most extreme, most hazardous, especially running Fairview, Camp Ramah, all the way over to Myers, that entire heavily forested area. On the east side of Deer Lodge, that's an entire hillside, massive area of dead forestation up through Rodeo, up through the backside of the Arbolada. All those areas are the most severe. It's extremely severe from that area behind Villanova to Hermosa Road, where we have Camp Comfort, up through Lower Country Club, and yes, Bill?
Anybody have a red Mini Cooper? Anybody have a red Mini Cooper?
No.
Okay.
Cooper.
There's a red Mini Cooper with a door open in the parking lot.
Not yet.
Sorry.
Okay. Where we then go from Camp Comfort, we go all the way up to the heavily forested area up Lower Country Club, into Country Club. We go into the lot. This is directly east of Ojai Valley Inn, which has not been cleared in ages, and that presents a problem. We then have the fire coming straight from Camp Comfort along Creek Road, past Country Club, all the way up to where Skunk Road intersects with Lower Creek. Lower Creek then goes north straight up through Stewart Canyon. That goes up to Lower Ventura and Lower Montgomery Street. That entire heavily forest riparian area is something that Mr. Farmer brought up the last meeting, stating that, like San Diego, we need to go back and take a look at that portion where he's explaining how that works with what he described as fingers. The fingers that are going up through, where you don't have that giant area on Fairview over to Deer Lodge, but you have these fingers that are coming up through the center of the community, where we have Upper Stewart Canyon, where we've got Signal Street, we've got Montgomery Street, we've got where Montgomery and Daly Street come in on the north end, which is heavily forested. You've got Gridley Road over there. We have between Gridley to the east, where we have the river, we have a sanctuary over there, and we have an enormous amount of fuel there.
Fuel break.
And if that wind is coming from the east, again, it is inside the city. I was asked by somebody what I thought, and they said, give us some areas you think wouldn't burn. And I said, what areas do you think won't burn? And the answer was Golden West. Well, with all the fuel behind Golden West from the east side, as we just saw it, had it gone across the creek, it would have been in Gridley, and then it would have been in Golden West. If you don't have enough water pressure and you have an adequacy of wind, there's a map over there that shows hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of homes in a subdivision gone in Santa Rosa, along with the hospital, along with the high school, along with the Walmart in town, and they were not in these heavy brush areas. So I don't believe we have a safe area in town that is not at least a minimum of high. And I'd say at least half of the community, if we take a look at that outside area and the barrier there, and we take a look at what Tom described the last meeting, where we have all these little ravines and fingers and pockets and areas going up, I think minimum of 75% of the community is high, the highest severity. Then we go to high. I don't believe there's anything below moderate. And our map shows no moderate whatsoever. And our map shows no high at all.
Bob, it sounds like you're saying the city and surrounding areas are at least high, if not very high, and we must have a lot of work to do here. Getting rid of the fuel load, the dead trees. I mean, we're not safe. We were lucky, but we're not necessarily safe with this kind of fuel load that you just pointed out. So how do we rate that on a fire map? Are all the areas very high?
I think the areas where you have the 4-inch wharf pipes, and we have a list of those 300 odd hydrants, and those areas where you have density, and those areas where you have a very heavy urban forest, and then there's areas where we have the finger canyons, and those finger canyons are all designated by the flood map because that's where the water used to come down and where all the fuel grew and now is dying off very rapidly because of the drought. And so we have a destructive urban forest. When you take a look at those, and you take a look at this other packet we have here showing the high fuel on the meadows outside of the high school. The high school was the only place, my understanding, and you guys helped me, that was the only place I understand that was designated as safe to shelter in place.
And only inside.
Was the high school gym. And if we take a look at everything to the west there, and if you take a look at the dynamic of where Taramina is in adjacent, and Catrona on the other side, they've probably lost half to 2/3 of that oak forest on the south side of their property where the crust of that big 118 meadow comes in. If that fire starts with the west wind over by the school and it roars up through that area, hits that oak forest, which will then have these massive ember showers going, we really have a 360-degree problem. Only we won't get a warning like we did from Santa Paula of 2 days. It'll be a couple of minutes and it'll be moving quickly. So I we have a whole bunch of rules we have to follow. And I think what we do is you start somewhere, you list some things, and start figuring it out.
Judy?
Is it our task this evening to recommend to the council how we want the map changed? And if so, by what process? Who do we bring in to help us with this? It was recommended that the Fire Safe Council be one group that could start working on making our local maps accurate. But I believe there are also people that have volunteered who are fire specialists. So is it our job to pull these people together and get a new map and recommend that to the city council? Or is it our job to just recommend to the city council that they do this and take these various things into account?
Can I say something? Yeah, didn't we, am I on here?
You are.
Okay. Didn't we have Doug Campbell came to one of our meetings here, and if I remember, he volunteered to help us on this, right?
Right.
I guess I'm more concerned what Steve had to say about this pressure on the fire hydrants. Because until that's mitigated, I mean, we could designate this whole area a high fire hat, but if we haven't got the means to fight it,
Well, no, I think that's what Board Member Daddy's,
Is your mic on? We can't hear you.
Yes.
People at home can't hear you.
I
Pull it
believe
up.
that's what Board Member Daddy is suggesting, that pending refinement of a fire hazard map relative to fuel loads, specific fuel load areas, considering we don't have a reliable, I don't think anyone considers, this isn't, me overstating the issue. We don't have a reliable fire water system. As such, that would support my thinking, a resolution to a recommendation to City Council that the entire city be deemed a very high fire hazard. Without water, it doesn't matter. You got wood structures. Even the structures that are covered in stucco have wood eaves, wood fascia, wood windows. It's there's very few structures, even the ones up on Foothill and on the top of Signal, very few structures that are actually built to resist fire with fire-resistant construction assemblies, and then of course, if I understand it correctly, the sphere of influence is once you get outside of the city, and you certainly go to the west to 33, and to the northeast, up Gridley to the top, and to the south, everything along Creek Road and to the furthest southwest would be red zones, very high fire hazard, which means that would trigger, relative to further work that we're going to have to do, that would trigger any work, any construction, any addition, any permits would have to reflect the California State Fire Code and incorporate fire-resistant assemblies in any new work that was done. And that's a significant issue. I mean, it's a burden to a property owner, as well as even from the enforcement perspective of the city. However, that's really the only reasonable reflection of the condition we have, and the only way of getting it to a point where it's less red on the fire map, and getting into an area where you have moderate. I don't think they're really reasonably, given the nature of being surrounded by mountains that are usually covered in brush, and being susceptible to both drought conditions and east winds during fire season, that there, if anything, there would be only pockets in the city that are moderate fire hazard. But even those pockets right now, we can't declare in reason to be moderate fire hazard without knowing that there's a fire water system that would support the fire suppression.
Two things I want to answer, Judy. I think what we need to do is we need to make a recommendation on the map, and we need to forward it to council, and we need to give them some alternative, which is you need to have a hearing. You need to listen to people. You're going to need to put it on the agenda. Bring some people in that can help us, like Will Castanian Fire Safe. Get Doug Campbell here to look at it and have him share. You have some maps, and we have some other maps that show what the fire behavior was during the Casitas fire, the Casitas Springs. We knew how dangerous that was. We would have lost an enormous chunk. With the wind blowing that way, we would have lost an enormous chunk with the wind blowing this way. Had it been the 60 miles an hour, we'd have probably lost a third of the city. If it had been the 80 mile an hour predicted, we wouldn't have any city, especially this building. And the wind can't cause a burn with fuel that's not there. And so I think we recommend the map, and we recommend some mitigation, such as redefining the urban forest and prohibiting certain types of insidiously explosive and combustible trees. We go ahead and we ask for the water testing and some other things where the city actively engages. The last time there was a water test was caused by the PUC. That was flow after the Public Utility Commission, having them force Golden State Water to do those tests and then mark the individual valves. We no longer have a PUC because the PUC does not regulate casitas. So we don't have that avenue to force the purveyor. Not that we need to force casitas. I think they're going to do their job. We need to take a look at some other issues. Since I have a number of homes that have been burned down, those that burned down the quickest, fastest, and easiest were those that lacked access. So where the fire department couldn't get in there, where they had to back out of there, there's certain areas up Foothill. You go down those roads, you cannot back a truck back. They really can't go there. So we need to take a look at that and some of the zoning issues. And where we have 4,000 square foot lots and 5,000 square foot lots, and we have the density 10 times as much as we do in some areas. When you have 10 times more residents on a street, you pick one, and you have 50, 75, 100 people hosing down their roof, and we have 4-inch lines running through there, nothing will come out of the end of that wharf pipe where they need it at the end of the street when the truck gets there. And so for that reason, I'm not here just to say, as the chair said, we need to paint it differently. It kind of looks like the whole thing needs to be painted red. And then what we need to do is go into specific areas and see what really doesn't belong there. Because right now, with what we have, the urban forest, the dead forest, we've got the riparian area. And when we take a look at where the brush is worse in the sphere of influence zone, 365 degrees around the city. And the city is overgrown, but it's even worse outside. So, I mean, I don't really see where we have a real haven and a risk. You know, we have a respite. The other thing I don't see is that we have an emergency system in place where we'll put the electronic road signs outside. The emergency radio system will work. We have given people some information. I know Fire Safe Council has put it in a phone book for years about making an emergency plan. I don't think we have a plan, and for a whole lot of good reasons. I just think that we live in one of those areas. The geology topography and the climate really force us to come back and make this thing a very high, severe zone. And I really can't see a single area that would be excluded within this 4.5 square miles.
Can I ask a
So-
question? Not that it matters, but out of curiosity, if we make the whole area, or much of the area, a high severity, what does that do to people's home and fire insurance?
Well, it didn't seem to do anything where we've had this map wrong for going on 11 years. The map's been wrong for 11 years.
Yeah.
Del Oro, northern, everything from Vista Hermosa north on Foothill to Foothill Lane to Mercer, where Pleasant is, in that one tangent that runs across the top. There are 220 properties in that zone, and they routinely sell, and there's no deviation in price. So I can't answer any more specific than I haven't seen a thing happen. We have a number of insurers that won't write business there, but you still have a number that do. And I don't believe, and you're the expert, Dale, not me, I don't believe that an escrow hasn't closed in this community, within the city limits, for lack of availability of fire insurance.
No, they seem to
Now,
get it.
Of course, doesn't necessarily, past conditions cannot guarantee future
They
freedom from impairment.
they can for 1 year.
Okay.
After a disaster for 1 year, the
Right,
insurance
so-
companies cannot do
The issue
cancellations.
is, if something is done by the council, and once again, irregardless of our recommendation, that in fact changes the fire map, and especially if it changes the fire map out to the limits of the sphere of influence, and if much of the city is represented as a high or a very high fire hazard severity zone, there is that potentiality. But then again, if the best means of reducing fire hazard is to have a fire water system that's functional and can be certified and reliable, zones of combustible fuel that are riven throughout the community are reduced, and clearances around structures are in fact maintained, then that should do what it's supposed to do, which is reduce the fire hazard.
Okay, so then would the fire map change down to moderate or low,
Well,
or how would we,
I
I
would
mean,
submit that what we would be, I would submit that what we would be recommending the council reflects the conditions that we have now, which
Yeah,
are very
yeah.
high fire hazard severity because of existing fuel, regardless of the source, whether that's non-native invasive species, just chaparral, or oak tree canopies, whatever, and riparian zones, just barranca over natural growth. But as that map is developed and then subsequent to conditions changing, then the map gets revised again. On a, as
like every 5 years or
well,
something like that?
or sooner. It depends, because at this point, notwithstanding what we're talking about doing as far as a map, which most of us had never seen
right.
before about 15 months ago,
Yeah,
and as Board Member Daddy made reference to, is not something that's really seemed to impaired real estate transactions or insurability. Now we're become aware of these conditions, but nothing's really moved the needle relative to the fire water system. And if we do something with this and we start talking about the implications to the building code, it's my experience in observing the machinations of city government that people get distracted by non-issues And the core element, the core issue, the core risk in this case is the fire water, which has not been
Right.
resolved.
Right.
So it's gotta be number one. Because if you have, once you have a reliable, certified, dependable fire water system, to the best extent that it can be achieved by the water purveyor, and then we have at least a element of I won't say security, but a safety component upon which everything else is based upon, is contingent.
I hope we're not asking everybody to cut down their oak trees and all their trees and everything. I could see getting rid of the dead growth around the bottom, which I read about once causes a lot of fires, and I can see all the dead trees and dead brush, all of that should be cleared. But I don't want to see the oak trees and,
So Chair, let me ask you, just kind of walk me through this. So we have a recommendation that we're going to make to the city council that, let's say the entire city's in a fire zone, and yet we're short of water. I mean, it sounds like that we really haven't got the capacity and the hydrants. Yeah, well, I mean, but how can we make a recommendation if we don't know?
Well, the first element of the recommendation is that the city council cause the water purveyor to provide a certification that the system meets firefighting requirements. They're well articulated and identified in the fire code. Whenever we've heard testimony from Ventura County Fire Department or the Fire Department Fire Protection District, they've been able to articulate what the pressure and the flow and everything bumped up in 2015. I would have been content with what the standards were in 2010 if they were achievable. I don't think even those were achievable.
Yeah.
I think they went up 20% on pressure and something like a similar amount, 15 or 20% on flow. That's what is required for new development. Okay, we're dealing with an aged and system that has all sorts of components in it that taken together don't produce that sort of thing. But we should also know, okay, where are our weak points?
Right. Well, where does Public Works come into this? I mean,
They don't.
They don't.
Tom, let me take you back 8 years ago. When it came time to put flow together, we had 15% water loss through the lines of all water. 15% was lost. We had 111 breaks in a single year. We had a water system that was so old they didn't know where the shut-off valves were, or we wouldn't have lost the playhouse. We had a pipe burst, which is a large one. We had a boil water order, meaning the water for the entire city was unsafe because they didn't get to that leak. When we fought them and went to the PUC and ordered the test, and they had to upgrade the system, and they acknowledged that they didn't have firefighting capacity, we had our next flow meeting, and I jumped all over Pat McPherson, who was chair of flow at the time, and I said, "What are you doing about these dozens of hydrants with black bags over the top?" And he came to city council meeting, that next meeting, and brought it up, and I'm sure Golden State monitored it. When they fired it up, the entire system blew out with all those black bags on it, on Gridley, flooded some homes in Golden West. And so we haven't had an adequate fire system. That was the only reason I got Flow together, was to get a fire system. So we didn't get into one of these zones where fire insurance was unobtainable. Any insurance companies went to the insurance service organization and moved us from a lower protection class, which we have a very favorable, to a high. I think what happens is we need to answer to the community. We had a mandatory evacuation of everywhere except for the high school gym. I think that's severe enough for us to make a recommendation that we have a severe map. and get some help from the community and some other departments, and we then see what we can do about a restricted or a removal of certain forests. Plants, oaks are not one of them. They're not spontaneously combusting like the pines, and they're not toxic like oleander, and they don't do these other things. We have a number of these very invasive trees that are really vehicles for ember showers. They got a very high canopy, so it's going to flow. We never got around to doing what we were supposed to do 4 years ago, which was to come up with building codes, remove Class C roofs, harden the building codes. And so there's about 8 or 10 steps that we really need to do. And I think we would be misleading everybody if we didn't let the people in the city understand that this is, in fact, a very high severity hazard community that we live in. That shouldn't, we shouldn't let people look at that map and see where it's gray, and it's really not.
So are
And
we going to
let them
recommend to the city council that this whole area then is a high severity
If you
zone?
can find a single area to me that we didn't need to evacuate and is safe and has access for trucks and has adequate pressure, then I think what we should do is we should carve it out. I just couldn't find any, and I've spent months and months and months on this.
No,
I've asked a lot of people. I've turned it over to other people. I've talked to architects, and I've talked to other people. I've talked to fire behavioralists. I've gone the gamut. I've talked to Fire Safe Council. We've talked to the fire departments. And we're going to have a new map in April, which is going to be developed by CAL FIRE. And Mr. Quillis, if you would like to step back up and repeat what was said, or I'll try to do it. But why don't you come on up about this is the map, and maybe you can articulate a little bit better, because this is something we've run out of time with.
I do recall speaking to this body once before and noting that the fire map showed the fringes of the city as red, very high severity, hazard severity, and the rest of the city as gray, no risk whatsoever. I live in the gray area, but I don't believe it's no risk whatsoever. That said, I do think that some gradation here would be in order. As I mentioned before, and as all of you have discussed this evening, there are at least two major considerations in determining the fire hazard severity. One is, well, I guess three. One is building construction. Mm-hmm. Do you have wood siding and a Class C roof, or do you have stucco and Class A roof, or do you have stucco and tile? That's one characterization of different parts of the city. A second characterization is, what is the fuel load in your area, live or dead? What is the fuel load in your area? And the third is, what is the availability of fire water in your area? And what concerns me most is the third piece right now, and I would contend we do not know. We do not know how protectable different parts of the city are right now, from my personal knowledge, because nobody's checking. And that said, I think that turning the entire sphere of influence map red is certainly going to get people's attention, but it's not going to be accurate because we don't know what the availability of fire protection is around the city. If the recommendation to council were to be, we think that many areas of the city, particularly where there's heavy fuel loads, need to be upgraded in terms of their fire hazard severity, I would agree that that's true. But until you make certain findings based on objective data, and the availability of fire water is certainly an objective piece of information, it's very difficult to say what should be very high, what should be high, what should be moderate, because you simply don't know.
Okay, but in
Thank
the
you.
absence of any empirical data regarding
Yeah.
Right.
the reliability of the water system,
Yep.
one of your legs of your three legs of your stool there don't exist, and it just fell over. So that, to my way of thinking, supports the recommendation that the entire community is at risk, and the entire community is at risk. Also, your number one leg was fire, what I call fire assembly. In other words, this fire-resistant construction,
Yep.
with very few exceptions, and that would be some of the newer residences, and to the best of my knowledge, almost all of those are in the perimeter areas of the community. There aren't any, because notwithstanding stucco cladding for siding and Class A tile, cement, or clay tile roofs, most of the ones, for example, that have been reasonably recently built, 70s, 80s, have a significant exposure from wood eaves, from wood trim. And in the case of, we just have to look north to the Sonoma fires, entire tracts were leveled. They weren't adjacent to particular wildland or heavy fuel loads. The conditions supported ignition from one from one structure to another. And there were also some issues with water availability, which is the case with a massive fire anyway. So bottom line on it is, I'm sure they didn't consider, it would not have even been reasonable to consider those entire communities as in a high fire severity zone, but the proof is in the pudding. In this instance, they're not there anymore. So it is a function after, as you've indicated, I've only been doing this. I consider myself to be a relative novice in this. I've only been looking into this fire water issue for 3.5 years or so. Let's call it 4. It hasn't changed. It hasn't changed through fire chiefs. It hasn't changed through water purveyors. It hasn't changed through city councils. It hasn't changed through changes of city managers. The reality of the situation is we have the same situation, unless someone can establish otherwise through some empirical evidence, as we had 4 years ago, 8 years ago. It just goes on. So and this community has, in its history, it's been very fortunate. I was here in '85. It could have burned up then. It's had a couple of fires downtown in its history, and and they weren't, and that was also at that time in 1917. I'm sure they didn't have a lot of water either. But ostensibly, we have more people, we have more structures, and we should have the technology to support a reliable fire water system. So I can't, lacking leg 1 of your stool and lacking leg 3 of your stool, there's no way it can support anything but the entire sphere of influence. And I'm sure someone could provide some exceptions relative to areas that don't seem to have a fuel load. But once again, until we have empirical data supporting a reliable fire water system, I got to say the entire community has a high fire hazard severity exposure.
Yes, I understand. You're saying we're going to classify everything as very high hazard severity until we learn different.
I
Right?
think that's prudent. And I think it's prudent from the perspective of, there's going to be a lot of people who are upset about that because of implications. But if we started talking about item 1 on our council-assigned task list, recommendations for code amendments enhancing fire safety and other concerns, folks are going to get lost in the weeds even looking at that stuff, or else it's just going to be, sure, great, let's adopt that. But those are the implements that you do to make your community safer once you have the basics in place. we don't have the basics in place, at least my opinion based on the empirical data that I've been exposed to.
No, and I would agree with you, but the solution that appears to be forming here is to say the sky is falling until we have the basics in place to decide it's not falling.
What would you say?
Pardon me?
What would you recommend to the council?
I would recommend a process that involves getting that empirical data and then analyzing various aspects of the city to see, because there are standards, I believe, that say what is the standard for very high or moderate or low fire hazard severity. If there are no standards, then it's just a crapshoot anyway. But I'm uncomfortable, of course it's my training to deal with real data, but I'm uncomfortable with saying the sky is falling when we don't know.
Well, then we need to convene, I don't know if we or the city council, or who needs to convene some group, including Doug Campbell and Will
Well,
Bastagna
I think
and
this
water
body,
experts.
yeah,
and-
I think this body could do a series of workshops, if you want to
Yes,
call
that's-
them
right,
that,
that's what I
and
think.
gather people together who can advise you, and gather the water purveyor
Cetus,
in
yeah.
those meetings to say, what do you know about the system, and what are you doing to upgrade the parts of the system that you know are insufficient, and begin with that kind of empirical data to decide the real risk, because that's what we're talking about is risk here.
Would it surprise you to learn that almost everything that you've just described has already occurred, either in a official capacity relative to the fire department, as well as standing there before the city council, as well as some meetings with fire department, protection department, district, as well as multiple conversations with the past water purveyor as well as the current water purveyor. And
Are you saying that the past and current water purveyors and the fire protection district already have this objective data that could be analyzed to grade the risk in different parts of the city? If that's, I would welcome the knowledge that in fact is so.
you don't have it when both the water purveyor and the fire department won't agree to flow test the system. The list of reasons, they sound like excuses to me, go from water conservation to stress on the system to they may be valid. I think I've heard them all. They may be valid individually, they may be valid collectively. The bottom line on it is we have not been able to be delivered any assurance or certification that we have a system that's functional by anybody. So there's a lack of either a lack of ability or a lack of will. I don't believe it's a lack of ability. That's their professional responsibility, duty, and experience. The issue at this point is it's a old and delicate system, and any sort of testing, which is the definition of testing, is going to stress that system and cause perhaps unanticipated outcomes.
If opening one fire hydrant at a time stresses the system, then the problem is a lot bigger than anyone is admitting.
Well, and we have heard all sorts of those reasons and rationales for not being able to produce assurances. And I don't mean assurances like everything's fine, guys. I mean written accountability that the system is functional and can produce even a nominal 70 or 80%. We can't even get close. It is oftentimes unreasonable to expect 100%. But if you can't get a nominal 70 or 80%, and we have a history of opening hydrants and nothing comes out, or insufficiency. What do you, how can it be addressed in any other way by saying the entire community is at risk? And maybe right now we're not as much of at risk because everything's been burned off on the outside. The downside to it, unfortunately, is everything that's left
It's inside.
is inside this sphere of influence, and I believe that increases the risk.
Because
Nothing
you-
left
I
to
didn't,
burn,
I didn't follow the last piece of
because
that
the only
train of
thing
thought.
left to
Yeah.
burn is in our backyard.
True.
That
And you
increases
don't
the
have
risk.
a 2-day warning like we did when Camp Comfort catches on fire down there where Creek Road comes in, and we get that strong east wind like we had at Casitas Springs. That fire was taking 250 feet a minute. It's going to take less than 10 minutes to go from Camp Comfort to Lower Ventura and Montgomery Street in the city. We don't have an evacuation plan. We don't have a warning system. And even where you had a warning system, like in Santa Rosa where they actually had an air raid system, they never triggered the system. Maybe we need that missile guy from Hawaii who can push the button for us and let everybody know we have a fire. I would say one other thing too. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time, but I've listened to 9 iterations of the blower issue. And I haven't heard council have a discussion on the fire issue. And I think by moving this thing forward, they have all the opportunity in the world to take certain areas out. If we just put in all the heavily forested area and we put in 300 feet on either side, and we took in all the 4-inch wharf pipes on either side, and we took it the rooftop to rooftop with the zoning and the older, we don't have any town left. And
Very
so,
little.
and so and if somebody can identify that area that we have that we say, nope, this is safe, that's great. And then maybe that little pocket should be left out. What we have now is a little pocket in 220 of the 3,500 homes. It should be maybe 220 are out and 3,300 are in. And then the other thing that I would ask everybody to think about, I don't know this because I know where I was, and I'm on a great street, lots of clearance, more than an acre, no eucalyptus zones. They removed that giant forest from behind your house and made the whole neighborhood safe. I got evacuated where I was with a modern house with no exterior wood, with clay tile, with no eaves, 100% stucco, no vegetation around the house. I don't know if we had a single area within the city limits of Ojai that wasn't evacuated. And I would say the sky isn't falling, but if it was important enough to evacuate everybody out of the entire community, maybe what we start with is the evacuation severity, and then we work our way down. If we can take the forest out, if we could remove the fuel, if we can have fire adequacy, or we can do what they did as a test, just pick one street. We'll pick Fulton or Drown, and we'll have everybody on the street open up their hose and hose their roof off, and have somebody open up the hydrant at the end of the street and see if there's anything there. Because that's exactly what happened in Santa Rosa, and that's what happened in Ventura. And when the fire department got there was nothing at the end of the line. So, thank you.
I hate to say this, we've seen a half hour of the glass bead game. Round and round with anecdotes, descriptions, stories. What we need is criteria, findings based on that criteria. We need to use tools like the franchise agreement that the city attorney, I've already vetted this with the city attorney. We can promulgate a new franchise agreement with our water purveyor. that has specific standards for fire protection and other things that we think are important to us. But I think these kinds of storytellings don't get us to action. We need criteria. If everything in the community needs to be classified as extremely hazardous, define that criteria. Define the criteria. I'm imploring you for other zones that we might want to add on to CAL FIRE zones. So then the findings can be made. So then the findings can be made of how we can change to move in, areas out of that zone. I don't have a problem with the worst case scenario if there's a finding on that we can objectively look at. But I got to tell you, if you make a recommendation without findings to council, council's not going to take it. All right? Unless you define what extremely hazardous is and show that these are our findings and this is why, according to this criteria, this should all be classified as extremely hazardous, there's not sufficient information for the council to act.
That was done in the discussion item with every single code that applies.
I understand, but what I'm trying to say is that that's what needs to be in the recommendation. Okay? Here's the criteria. Here's the zones, the definitions we would like to specify for the different zones. And this is why we're making the findings along these lines. What should be in the franchise agreement in terms of fire hydrant performance? I don't know if I can carry the water for the council to go to that direction, but I think that's the tool we have in terms of the city limits to put in place fire, rather than asking or hoping they're going to do the right thing. We can have standards. Now, it might be controversial. It might be a subject of some discussion with the water purveyor. They might say, well, if you put those standards on us that we're not having in the rest of our district, you're going to have to pay higher rates or something along those lines. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm saying these are the way to get to the tools we need and the specific recommendations that council can act on. So I implore you to try to get to criteria and findings and specific recommendations and not just go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Okay? I really ask you to do that, please. And I think you're dealing with incredibly important life safety issues here, but we know the danger, we know the concern, let's get to action items that we can implement, is what I'm trying to say. If we're looking at, for example, we don't need to reinvent the wheel about combustible vegetation. There's a California council called the Invasive Species Council of California that has rated every invasive species for fire impact. It's published information. So we can, for example, adopt specific measures in our city to say we're going to have a policy in our city of reducing fire risk vegetation, especially from invasive species. Eucalyptus groves carry fire, oak doesn't. Bottom line. Also, well-irrigated citrus groves don't carry fire. In fact, the fire department uses citrus groves for defensibility. But if we go to stage 4 and can't irrigate, we lose that. So it's fire and water together. What I'm trying to say is, please try to get to the specific recommendations of criteria and findings. And if we want to add some zones on top of the CAL FIRE zones for fine-tuning, let's do it with criteria and findings. So that's what I implore you to do, because a default classification of extreme fire risk might well be warranted. But I can tell you, if it gets to council's going to look at it and say, well, what's the criteria used to come to that recommendation? So I felt I had to stand up and just kind of.
I'm happy because the city has never adopted a fire map. The city has had someone adopt one for them, but the city has never adopted their own.
And our city has a tradition, unfortunately, an unfortunate tradition of not maximizing standing up for the welfare of its citizens by exercising its sovereign rights. We have a tradition of not doing that.
But it sounds to me.
And I think that this is an example of where we can take whatever CAL FIRE does, we can provide our input. Then why didn't that happen? The people that were involved in the council and the staff years ago didn't bother. to provide input into the CAL FIRE classification
Weren't
hearings.
interested.
Didn't bother, didn't care. We care now. I think we all do. So, you know, intelligent input into the CAL FIRE hearing process, and then adding on top of that, which we have every right to do, additional classifications based on clear definitions and criteria and findings, I think is well merited. But, you know, I think that we've got to get specific here, rather than just, well, you know,
Can I
we got to get specific. We got to have policy implementation.
Yeah, but actually,
You know?
I think two things. One is we've been discussing the parameters. As
Yes.
far as the criteria, you take it, that's taken right out of the fire hazard severity zone remapping project
Right. And so if
description
there's an
from 2007.
yeah, and what's the criteria under the current cycle?
Well,
That was from '07. This is almost 10 years later.
Yes, irregardless, it, model incorporates a measure of fire probability predicated on frequency of fire weather, ignition patterns, expected rate of spread, and/or past fire history similar to techniques used to calculate fire rotation as used in the development of fire
So
threat.
take the criteria, make the findings on the basis of that criteria, and pass on a recommendation to council based in that format. Okay? Here's the criteria. This is the current criteria. Here are our findings based on that criteria.
Okay. I'm gonna make a recommendation
Okay?
that we go ahead and have the entire city and the sphere of influence, which is contiguous, that has a heavy fuel load, have it fire mapped. There are enough stipulations and enough guidance in the CAL FIRE web that give us those different things that we need and give us the difference in definitions, which is the hazard we have, which is the fuel load, and the severity it can cause if it burns. So if we have contiguous brush that runs from Deer Lodge all the way over to Clough Park, then that is a single area that we can fire map. And we can go ahead and do a few things, which is make a recommendation that the city actually adopt their own map. We go ahead and take a look at the fuel load and have that thing mapped using Doug Campbell's program. We then go ahead and take a look at what's allowed as far as the defensible space, the availability of water, the forestation, you know, where the different fingers, the riparian areas are, and those zones, and we just start putting everything in there till there's nothing left. And then the map will just speak for itself.
Are we going to do that tonight?
No, we're not going to do it tonight. I think what we need to do is we need to come up with a list of what we need to do for the matrix and start with some of the items that are the finger zones that Tom has brought up, the urban forestation, and the fact that the council needs to eliminate combustible, dangerous, invasive plants, and take a look at the Santa Barbara plan that only allows so many of these invasive clumps of forest like we have on Lion Street. They would only allow maybe 5 or 10 instead of 50 or 75 eucalyptus trees in a big stand if they're a certain variety. Take a look at the access roads. Take a look at those areas that have got 4-inch lines. We know where they are. We actually have the maps. We see where they are. We take a look at those areas, and Mr. Quillisi has got that list. And we take a look at those valves and those hydrants that haven't been tested in at least 5 years. And we include those zones in there. And then by the time we're done, we will have come up with a local map that includes 100% of the city anyhow. We'll just do it by definition.
Okay,
The result will be the same.
okay. So do you want to put a motion together that we can vote on?
Sure, I think that before the motion, we need to hear from everybody on the board here, what they think should be here, what their concerns are, what questions that they're going to have. See what everybody on the board thinks, and then we come up with a list of action items and information we need to make this recommendation. We put it on the next agenda. We ask the staff to get us certain information. And then I'll tell you how this thing works by osmosis. We were having a rate increase 4 years ago at Casitas, and I asked Judy Murphy to come with me to a meeting. And they have an entire matrix by Rafaelis. And what they said was, we need to increase or decrease the size of a water line. And we need to do it because a 10-inch water line represents 522 domestic users. And so when you take a look at those density, how many users we have, and you're going to know that the people are going to go ahead and have their hoses on, so we can be assured that all 4-inch lines and 4-inch wharf system would be by definition put in an area, and we can go ahead and we can circle that area, and then we can go ahead and put that surrounding area that would be encompassed, and then we can just take the areas one by one. We can take the areas from Country Club all the way up to Ventura Street and along Creek Road that don't have a single hydrant, that are heavily fueled, that everybody understands Lower Stewart Canyon, and we can go ahead and include that. We can include the Country Club by definition. We'll just do them all one at a time, area by area, until
When are we
we've...
going to do this?
Well, we're going to do it next meeting,
But we have a full agenda next meeting, an important one, too.
which is...
It's not more important than, well, it's the ADUs and all that stuff. I mean,
Maybe we need an additional meeting.
or convene a group. I mean, I don't know. And you know, there are other water purveyors besides Casitas in this sphere of influence, too, that we need to include.
In this city, we've got Casitas and Casitas.
But in our sphere of influence, I mean,
Is it imperative that we come up next meeting and with this recommendation? It sounds like it's going to take a little while to do this, especially if we don't know I don't know what Doug Campbell's schedule's like, and,
Well, I don't know that Doug actually wants to do it. He'll help.
yeah.
But
But I
we-
would think that, Bob, that we would need some time to go over this.
We've been waiting for 7 years to get this done.
so what do you recommend?
Well, I recommend we stop putting it off and just get
So
it
make a
done
motion.
and get it to the council and let the council look at it. If council doesn't have enough information, they can certainly call Casitas, they can certainly call the fire department. They can go ahead and get the information from all these people. We just need to raise the question and the conclusion.
Okay.
It's not our job for policy and answers.
Can I make a motion?
Yeah, well,
I don't want- we
I
can
want to
make a
hear
motion.
from Judy, and I'd like to hear from Tom. I want to hear what everybody's ideas
We
are
can hear from
first.
everyone after we make the motion and second it.
Okay,
I'm not trying to push it. What do you think?
Go ahead.
Chair Ulrich?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I make a motion based on all of the discussion we've had tonight, notwithstanding what Bill Wyrick said, but that we do recommend to the city council that we consider, I'm not saying this is firm, we consider the entire area as very high, or at least high, if not very high, because of the building construction, because of the fuel load in the area, and because of the availability of fire water, which we are not sure of. That just for for the sake of being safe, that we recommend this as an extreme fire area. Do you agree with that? Based on what you've heard?
We're going to have some discussion on this?
Yeah, we are.
I think it goes back to what do you want to do? Do you
Okay.
want to do the research? Do you want to come
Oh,
up with a
we do.
rational plan? Or do you want to kind of punt it to the council? And that's kind of what I'm.
Yeah, that is it, but my recommend,
That's kind of-
until that research is done, and until we know what, we do the study, we should, I think, at least consider this as a very high area. That's my motion.
I'm going to second it for discussion.
Okay.
And what I'm going to say is, Tom, you and I've been through this for years and years and years. I don't want to prove things where there's not question. So I don't want to spend 100 hours trying to say we've got all this information where none of those questions are asked that cost us 100 hours of research. We may go to the council and say, we think this whole thing is severe, and they could say, we absolutely agree with you, and now how do we mitigate it? Not how do we put it in, but how do we mitigate it? And so why do we want to put all the effort on the recommendation when that's easy? Everybody got evacuated. Maybe we need to put all the effort on, they say, okay, we agree with you, now tell us how to get out of this. That's where we should be spending our effort, not trying to move them into it. Anyhow, that's my thought.
But I'm not sure what you said just now. Are you saying we should recommend it as a very high fire area, or say we don't know, or where are we?
I think we're just in a discussion.
I said I second it, and I think what we need to do is instead of coming up with a whole bunch of front-end time, let's recommend it.
Oh, okay.
The council will say, we disagree,
Okay.
we need more information here, we want this. I mean, I don't want to bring a whole smorgasbord if the person just wants a hot dog.
Gotcha.
You know,
Okay.
I just want to bring what they want. I don't want to do all these other things. And let's see what they want. The only way we're going to know what they want is by proposing it and then listening to what the pushback is.
We know what one's
And
gonna
then the
say.
council will give us direction. And we went through, I listed every single item that says, here's this, this is what the code says. We went through that ad nauseum last time. We've been through this for 7 years. This isn't the first time. We've been through this for 7 years, Dale.
Okay.
And I think it's finally time to just say, if they don't believe it's a high hazard area, well, then I think council needs to take the responsibility for that.
Well, I agree with you, Bob, and I think, and I agree with Councilman Wyrick, but coming up with specifics and the criteria in 1 month's time, I don't think we can do that. I think if we made the council aware of the situation like what you're talking about, that we are in a high fire danger, and that these will be, you know, some of our recommendations after we do some research, whether or not if we spend some time with Doug Campbell or whoever, open it up to a public meeting, get some feedback. But I think it's, I agree. I think it's imperative that we voice our opinion with the council that we feel that we're at a pretty high fire danger.
Okay.
And I agree, Tom, but my thought on that is they may just say, okay, give us the findings and we're in. Again, I don't want to do a whole bunch of preparatory work to convince somebody that's already in the choir. If they're not in the choir, I'd like to make the recommendation, tell us what they're not in the choir about. So then we can just go back to those specifics. So then we can just get the fire behavior, or we can just get the hydrants tested, or we can just come up with the invasive species, or we can just, and the city knows where they need to remove a bunch of this stuff.
Okay.
Those would be some specific recommendations.
I would like to see us come up with the recommendations to council for concrete steps that they can take to mitigate the fact that we are basically in a red district. If we just go to them and say the whole map should be red, it'll change who has to build their house to what level of fireproof, but it doesn't really help the council create ordinances that will make us safer. So I would like to spend a little more time on it, like Mr. Farmer said, and come up with that list of what we need to look at, specifics.
So hold off on any recommendation to city council. Okay.
Mhm.
Chair Ulrich, this is a discussion.
Well, I'm just, I'm in synthesizing this down. If we provide,
Pull the bike.
excuse me, if we provide a extensive amount of support for findings, as I indicated earlier, that oftentimes becomes a distraction because certain elements in the findings or the information that support the findings become the subject matter of the conversation. I'd like to keep it to I'd like to keep what this board resolves as far as findings and recommendations to the city council as simple as possible for both comprehension by the community as well as digestibility. And I would, and I'm not making a specific resolution or suggesting a resolution right now, but I think something along the lines of that this board has found that the city of Ojai is exposed to a very high or a severe fire hazard ongoing condition due to the following criteria. And one is the no certified or reliable fire water system. Number two, that there are existing levels of combustible fuel stockpiles within the city and the city's sphere of influence. Number three, that there are areas where, based upon physical conditions that give a likelihood that an area will burn without considering modifications such as fuel reduction efforts. In other words, they're going to burn anyway. And that reduction of relative density of vegetative fuels that can initiate fires within the city, exist within the city's core. That's just three elements. That's criteria. That is findings. What this is based on is what has been previously examined by CAL FIRE, what we've heard in testimony, and is otherwise, I believe, incontrovertible. That's fairly simple. It's I think would be supported by another, say, three recommendations. One of them is to obtain a certified, reliable fire water system. Two is to engage in a program of assessment and elimination of combustible fuel stockpiles within the city and within the city's sphere of influence, and then be very specific relative to further enforcement of fire code within the city, because I don't think that's happened. We heard the building official at the last meeting indicate that six notices had been issued in the last 12 months. And so really what we're talking about is all very basic stuff here.
And would you put on your list an acceleration of a review of the building codes, including the elimination of shake roofs and a sunset, a time for removal of all shake roofs within the city, except those that are state exempt, Mills Act, heritage, and landmarked structures? We're going to have to eliminate that Class C sooner or later. We're going to have to eliminate some of this stuff. We're going to need to make our codes better. And we find that the ember showers are the things that are taking homes down from the roof line down because the grids in the screens in the attics are the old 1/4 inch code, and they really need to move down to an 1/8 of an inch. And we can require that that safety upgrade be done with all permits done above a certain level to a house. If somebody's going to put a roof on, they've got to do the screens. If they're going to do an addition, if they're going to do an X amount of remodel, they need to do some basic things that keeps their house from combusting and burning down the next row of houses. So that's the other thing. And I think you have enough findings. I think you have a big enough list. I think that list can be regurgitated and submitted along with a severity recommendation. And then the council can go back and sift through it, because I doubt we're going to have a council person that is going to say, we don't have an extreme fire severity within this community as it exists today. Forget about all the maps. All the maps are irrelevant because they've all changed. What does exist is the current hazard within the city today.
Is that your
So-
motion, Bill, what you just read?
Well, I think it's gonna need to get refined a little bit, because it's quite, this is what we're going to ultimately,
Isn't it our
Sam?
job to make the council aware of this?
yeah, and that's what this recommendation and, will,
Can't we simplify this down to where we don't have to be too specific, without doing some further studying on this? It's hard for me to be exactly specific that the flow in the water meters or the hydrants are as bad as what we're led to believe. I don't know whether they are or not. It seems to me the council would come back and say, all right, prove it.
prove what?
Prove that the
Prove that
hydrant-
they're bad.
Yeah, but, here's the thing, that's like saying, okay.
Who can do that?
This is a prototype aircraft. It should fly. We're sure it's gonna fly when we need it to fly. Well, someone asked, have the engines been tested? Well, no, but we have a lot of confidence it's gonna fly. You can't prove a nullity. Okay? So what I'm gonna suggest is, at this point, let's table this. I'm going to draft a resolution and submit it before us for affirmation to the council at the next Building Appeals Board meeting.
Okay.
And that, at this point, should address the recommendation. We can refine it, obviously, at that point, but I'm gonna have it broadly enough and also with enough criteria and support that it should be fairly simple to, for us to affirm.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
That sounds good to me. That sounds good.
Okay,
Are
a
you-
motion's been made and second. Dale, you made a motion?
Withdraw?
We have a second?
I'm willing to withdraw that motion in lieu of what Chair Ulrich has just stated.
Nope, okay.
I would ask another thing too, and Tom, what I think by going quicker in this is, Casitas has already acknowledged that they have an engineering issue. They've known we've had an engineering issue since 1959, when Casitas was created. They've known that this is a substandard. The mayor made a quote, "You bought a pig in a poke." No, they knew it was a pig, and they knew it was dilapidated. We've known that since ex-mayor Olson's house went down. I don't believe the valve was not incorrectly turned. There's just too many instances of no water. We've had no water when people drive over hydrants, and there's no water coming out. And the prior county chief had to sue Golden State as the purveyor to get adequacy in the water. And we've had that blown out on Kenyatta. That was there for months. We had the blew out right next to your house. That was uncontrollable because they're violating their own interagency recommendations of exercising the valves every 3 years. When they needed money, they went to the PUC, and they always quoted the American Water Association. When it comes time to enhance our system, they seem to ignore it and not even think that it exists. And so I'm saying, as a matter of urgency, if we don't get this done immediately, if council does not adopt a local map, ask then that CAL FIRE adopt our map and incorporate it into their map. We're going to miss the cycle. And this will then be 10 or 12 years of going through the mapping done in 2007 with an update in 2020 will be 13 years. And I doubt there's anybody on council that's going to say we don't have a problem. If that's what they're going to say, they should have seen the sheriff in his SWAT uniform knocking on the door telling me to leave. And so I think we get that message, and I think if we go through the years and years and years of discussion that this community does with no resolve, then the next fire will be here and gone, and we'll say, golly, we could have, should have done that because we've been messing around with it since 2007. I think we let them go. If they need more help, they need more study, they need more empirical, we can do a bunch of things. We can have Mr. Campbell here. We can have Mr. Williamson from the fire department here. We can go ahead and have the people from the CAL FIRE here. We can certainly have Chief McNeil here. We can have Casitas here. We can have an awful lot of people here. And then let the council ask the questions that they determine that they need to come to a conclusion. I'm just afraid that we can make this thing so large, trying to outguess what their questions might not be, that it will take forever. And we have until April to get through this process where the city has some type of cogent plan to submit to CAL FIRE, because CAL FIRE, as Mr. Quillisi well remembers, says we have our map and we're going through with our map. Well, the people of this community don't have their map. So when do we meet again, Chair?
I'd like to hear comments from the new building official over here. Yeah, as the new building, what's your input, or, I mean, what's your feelings?
I actually think Chair Warwick's recommendation makes a lot of sense. We get stuff written down, have some direction. And also, you can still debate that next meeting. Once he puts it down, we can get a chance to take a look at that and debate that a little bit too. But I think you need to give something to council, not just it's a red zone.
Right.
And even give them options of maybe items which are the shortcomings, and maybe then decide what they can do with it. I think I like what the chair's done, and let's take a look at what he's put together next time, and then we can have some comments on his resolution.
And what do we have scheduled for the next meeting?
Next is 20th, February 20th.
Okay, all right, so,
Do we need to put another meeting in there so that we can just discuss this?
February 20th?
Do we need another meeting that we can just focus on this? You mean in between meeting? Yes.
And one of the things I would like to see, Chair, if we can't get the help, we can't do this. What we really need is a PowerPoint. We need that topo map so it can be visualized. We need the existing severity map so we can have an overlay. We need the sphere of influence so people can get an idea of where that goes. We need to have the flood map overlaid so they see where all the riparian area is and the heavy forestation. And then they need to have one where we kind of distill down and say, we think all of these areas, because of contiguous fuel, the hazard, where we'll have the severity, and have that as like a fifth map, which is an overlay. They're just simply going to be one over the other. So when that PowerPoint's done, that can be submitted to council, and they don't have to guess, and they haven't spent that much time, and so they're not going to be confused. And I'll be more than happy to run around, take a bunch of photos, and just show all this heavy fuel in the area, and then we have a corresponding map where we can point to it. Because everybody's driven by these areas and seen it. They just need to put the thing together. But I really think we need to have another one. I really think we need to be wrapped up in February. It's got to be the council in March. In March, they've got to get through this, March and April. In April, submit it to CAL FIRE. Because CAL FIRE is leaving again without us, and it'll be another decade. And they skipped the map. Supposed to do one every 5 years. They did it in 7, adopted it in 10. They were supposed to have a review in 15. They skipped it. Too busy putting out fires. And so here we are again, too busy putting out fires to update our map. And I just think it's time. We can't avoid it any longer.
Do we have to get on the city council agenda? And maybe that request could come in soon?
Well, let's generate the resolution and then request that it be on the next
Okay.
available agenda.
Available.
And count on it. It might get on that one, but it more than likely would be on the one after that. Okay, do we be, okay,
Are you going to pick a date for the next meeting? It needs to be before February 20th. That's too long.
okay, well, having said that, Tuesdays are the open dates. We have obviously the 30th of this month, and we have the 6th of February and the 13th of February, and something tells me there's,
February 6th is great.
There's a council meeting on the
Council meeting?
13th.
I was about to say there's
Great.
gonna be a council.
And what's the meeting after that?
13th.
That's just the week before.
Before, so that doesn't make sense.
So I
And
think
what's the meeting before this, what's the meeting before?
the 30th of January.
That's on
That's a good one?
Tuesday.
That's not a good one for me, because we've got the school board bond oversight. We're finally. City council meeting.
Council meeting.
No, the council's on the 13th. Yeah.
6th.
6th is clear.
6th is clear.
This is clear,
That's the date.
right?
6 o'clock, VAB, on the 6th.
Okay, now, since we're in between, Mr. Vega, Mr. Ulrich, to clear us for the Brown Act, request should go through you for continuity right now, because we're in between changing building officials. And the board chair is going to need to submit a resolution to the board members, so the board members can take a look and they can add their information back, send it back to you, so we can get a concise, full agenda with supporting materials, PowerPoint and references. So the only way we can really do this without having a chain email
Yeah, okay.
is how.
I got that part. When
Okay.
you get going this PowerPoint, who's doing that and
Staff needs to do a PowerPoint, because the PowerPoint has to have the maps, and we need to look at them to make sure that they're correct and they're what we need. So when it gets done to council, we've already seen it. I don't want them submitting something that we haven't seen.
Okay, well.
Fair enough? We've had that happen before.
Well, we're
It hasn't worked out well.
That where we need to see something from the last meeting, right? So yeah. Okay.
But the point is you need to submit all of this information to Mr. Vega so he can send it to the board, so we can stay within the Brown Act confines of not having a serial meeting.
Okay. So we've confirmed the 6th. Then can't do the 30th because you have a conflict. I have a conflict on the 6th, which I guess I'm going to eliminate by canceling that.
Thank you.
It involved dinner too, so.
Well, this involves the $30 million school bond that hasn't had a lot of spending going on. and we need to get on the stick, and we need to do some spending, and we've got some projects, and we need to move and get some of these things completed for the community.
That's what I got going. But I'll be here.
You're canceling your trip to Hawaii, Tom?
No, I'm gonna go pig hunting.
Pig hunting?
Wild boar hunting.
Yes,
Oh, that's right.
yeah, yeah.
Can't say that.
Okay, do we, at this point, want to enter into even the beginning of discussions regarding the flood maps? Okay. In that case, fabulous.
I would make a request that the board chair make a request of whoever the person is in charge. I really think that the community deserves to have a current fire map in the lobby. And I really think the community deserves to have a flood map in the lobby. So when people walk into the building permit area, they can simply look at it and go, my God, I'm in a fire and a flood zone at the same time. And we have that going on. I think that's part of the transparency that everybody professes that we're going to have, but we never get to see it. So I would hope the chair would take up that discussion with the appropriate authority.
Thank you so much. Okay, any other comments, questions? None. In that case, then I'm going to adjourn this meeting at
Table the motion.
8:17.
I withdrew the motion and then can I come back on the
Okay,
6th?
he says he's gonna come back and table. Okay.
See, what you don't know around here